Hey, welcome to Level with Emily. In this episode, you'll hear from Erik Desiderio. We've had Erik on the show a couple different times before, and this time we're going to be talking about a game that's in open beta. It's called Last Epoch, and Erik has been working on the music for almost a year now and has quite a bit more music to put in the game. So we talk about that, what he's working on now, what he plans to be working on in the future. And here's Erik.
The game is called Last Epoch, and it's an action RPG where it relies heavily on time travel. So if you can imagine Back to the Future meets Game of Thrones, that's sort of where we're coming from with this. And it's really fun because like you'll be talking to a character or in one era, and then in another era, they're like this big mutated creature that you're fighting as a boss battle. So it's like, and then you're like, how did this happen? And there's a lot of blanks that get filled in as you go through the adventure and as you discover more. And you find out that pretty early on, so I'm not giving away a serious plot point, that like basically the world is becoming ruined and there's creatures from the void that have basically taken over all of humanity. And it's up to you to go back in time and right all the wrongs and figure out how to save the world. So the game is divided up into basically 4 different eras. And one of the eras, which is the ancient era, is a very Viking-like sort of primitive era where there's not much technology going on. So that's sort of where I came at the theme from, because that's a lot of your early experience in the game is playing in this ancient era. So the theme kind of is a Viking influenced theme, I should say. But it's a wonderful game, and I've been working with the team since February, and it's really fascinating because it's a totally remote game studio. So if you can imagine, there's people from all over the world working on this game, and they came out with a map recently, like on the website. It was like where everyone lives and works. And, you know, there's people from Brazil, people from Europe. I talked to a Scottish guy today, you know, and then there's a guy in Australia where it's like a little tricky with the time periods and stuff because of like everyone's trying to convene. But since it started in Texas, we basically kind of like coalesce around that time zone and try to make it work.
Nice. Yeah, I had forgotten that studio, that's such a unique setup. I mean, maybe less so now, but even still to have everyone, like literally there's no building anywhere in the world, right? It's like everyone is working from home or
exactly
whatever. Yeah,
or
that's
office
really cool.
or
Yeah, cool. And the game, I mean, what a fun concept. So like talk a little bit more. You talked about, you know, kind of having like a Viking influence for the main theme, and I love how really just, you know, the plucked instruments and dulcimer and bells and just kind of folk type sound as well for the soundtrack. So talk a little bit about that style.
Sure. So with the theme, there's a lot of tagelharp on it, which is an ancient instrument from Scandinavia, and it's got 3 strings, and you play it with a bow, and it has a sort of a box-like shape. It's very square, it's rectangular, and so it makes it a little harder to rock out on it because you know you're trying to like put it in your lap and hold on to it and stuff, or like, you know, guitar just kind of sits there in your lap and it feels really natural. This is like it took me a while to get used to it. And the strings they look like twine. I think they're technically nylon, but it's very coarse looking. So if you look at it, you know, just imagine a piece of twine with like little bits of it kind of spindly coming off of it. Well, at least the tagelharp that I'm playing is like that. And you play with this bow that, you know, it's horsehair bow, and you use rosin. And when I went to college, I was an upright bass major, so I felt like, hey, this should be easy for me to pick up. And it was a lot easier than if I hadn't played it like a stringed instrument, like a bowed stringed instrument before. But it was like there's a lot to get used to, and the way you hold the bow is different. And I had to practice it a lot in order to like be able to play tagelharpa on it. And the tuning, you know, you tune it like between takes. It's like
really?
By the end of the take, it's out of tune. Yeah, it's one of those kind of things.
Yeah. So how did you stumble across that instrument as the choice there?
Well, I was just doing research on ancient folk instruments,
Mm.
and there's a band called Vardruna, and they did a lot of music for the Vikings soundtrack, like the TV show Vikings on
Yeah.
I think it's on National Geographic, and the main guy from that band plays the tagle harp, but he's got like a giant like beefy rock star tagle harp. I'm playing a small one like this, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And but like one of my friends had a tagle harp, so I borrowed it from him and just was like, okay, I'm going to get into this and really like figure out how to play it. But of course, early on, like when you're just trying to sketch out the song, I use like a virtual instrument tagle harp, which you can, you know, play the notes on the keyboard, and then
Okay.
it plays back a recording of a dude playing the tagle harp. And then, you know, I kind of worked it out and sketched it out like that, and then I figured out how to play all those parts on the actual instrument. And there's no fretboard, right? So it's not like you're
Yeah.
pushing a string down onto a piece of wood. You're just pushing the note down with your finger, and your finger is the fret, right? So
Yeah.
you can totally play it out of tune very easily
Yeah.
and not get a good sound. So it was really tricky to figure out and get a good sound. But it sounds really interesting. I mean, like if you play it slowly, like the long notes, it sounds like a door that's creaking open almost. It has this
Yeah.
weird old ancient sound. And then with the theme, there's these big hits that don't don't don't. And for those, it's a lot of open strings on the tagle harp where you're not fingering a note. It's just
Mhm.
the strings are resonating by themselves, playing um, those notes, and that cuts through in this sort of like upper mid-range scratchy like weird ancient sound. And then I had the cello player also play basically the same part but an octave lower with open strings, like two strings at the same time playing these
Mhm.
chords, which you don't really do that on cello much. People, they want to push a note down so that they can make it sound more refined and put a little vibrato into it, right?
Mhm.
But with the open strings, it sounds uh, it sounds more raw and like visceral, and
Yeah.
it sounds less refined, right? The
Yeah.
refinement, I feel like, it comes from like the play using vibrato and everything.
Mhm.
So the tagalharpa playing like sort of this higher part, and then the cello filling in the bottom with these open chords, open strings, and then there's a djembe that was playing for like the real
Oh.
low part to like boom 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 to give it the
Yeah.
percussive, the boom at the bottom.
Fun.
And so in the theme you hear that a lot. And then we also had the vocalists sing on top of that, and they're singing fjord uld, which is in Old Norse. It means ancient era, which is one of the eras of the game. So like I was trying to tie in like the different eras of the game into the soundtrack. So it would be kind of fun for people that are get really into it, and they want to investigate more about the music and more about the game. It sort of adds another layer of interest to the game, I feel
Yeah.
like.
Oh, definitely. And like when you change times, or when players time travel,
Uh-huh.
you mentioned Back to the Future, which of course makes me think of the 80s.
Sure.
But all the music that I heard from you follows this older style, the folk kind of, with these, strings and things like that. So, and not necessarily orchestral, but there's some string playing in there too. But are there stylistic shifts then to the more modern times, musically speaking?
Absolutely. And that's something that we're investigating right now is we're trying to give each era, there's four different eras, we're trying to give each era a different sound.
Mm-hmm.
So like the ancient era is more of a Viking sound, and more of these primitive instruments, lots of percussion, lots of stuff that people could play with a very small amount of technology. And then as the ages progress and the technology changes, then the sound of the music is going to change as well. And so the next era is the divine era, and that visually has a look that's more like Greek and Roman. You could say, but last epoch version of Greek and Roman.
Okay. Yeah.
And so then we're that's a lot of what we're doing now is we're working out how the different eras are sounding. So a lot of the music I sent to you was from this era, and is from the most recent expansion, which is the Sands of Majasa, and that era has a lot of plucked instruments, and I put reverb on the instruments to make them have a sort of a delay and like a repeating effect. There's an echo sound to a lot of these instruments.
Oh, cool.
So it plucks it once, plung, 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 and then I was able to make cool like rhythms out of those the delay sound out of the echoes, which sort of layered on top of the percussion and all the different instruments to have like this interesting sound that sort of pulled it all together, like with the echo, and that became like a sort of featured part of that era. And then there's other eras. There's like an era with all of these undead creatures, and that's the Imperial Era, and that's the next era that happens chronologically after the Divine Era. And then the Ruined Era is at the very end, where the last dregs of humanity are just holding on to to this world, and they're just trying to survive and trying to send you back in time to try to fix everything, all the stuff that went wrong. And so we're this game is still in early access, so that's a lot of the process we're going through now, is like figuring out how to refine the music that's in there and trying to like coalesce around these different sound for each era, which is really exciting. It's a really fun part of the process that we're doing right now.
No, that would be fun to be able to shift musically as well, as a composer, as opposed to just staying in one style for a whole game like usual.
Totally. And the cool part is like we're still trying to make everything sound like last Epoch and trying to give parts of this theme into the different eras. But like, how do we weave this theme into an era where the instruments are so different? It's just the melodies, the rhythms, and so all these different things that we're playing around with to try to figure out how to really pinpoint each era and get the sound of each era and coalesce it.
So talk to me about then it's Majelka or Majasa. Which one's the new expansion? I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So the new expansion is the Sands of Majasa.
Majasa. Okay. Yeah. So talk to, because you sent me some of those tracks too, and I really liked that. So talk about, like the Temple of Majasa and stuff like that.
So the Temple of Majasa is a temple in the middle of the sand, and there's cities that are surround it. And the Sands of Majasa is an expansion based on basically giant snakes. So they're the creatures are that you're fighting most of the time and you're interacting with are snakes, and they have these vessel maidens that they use to sort of store their life force and impart their life force on others, so they can basically live forever. And so how do you make music sound like snakes? How do you evoke that with people? Well, so I guess the Temple of Majasa is probably the track we should look at, and that has a lot of it's a very intense track, because you're going in the middle of this temple to fight the big boss at the end, and who is a giant snake, and of course. And and so the music is like super dramatic, it's heavy, it's got these strings that are have these descending patterns that at the beginning, and it's just supposed to fill you with a feeling of intense dread and despair, because it's this giant temple and you go through all these different levels of it, and the creatures of course get harder and more difficult to fight the further you get into it, until you fight the boss at the end. And so there's a lot of strings that are playing tense textures that are sort of trying to evoke the feeling that you feel when you see a snake. Like I feel the hair stand up on my arms and on the back of my neck, and the strings, I feel like a lot of times are a good way to evoke that. Sort of like you feel that in horror movies a lot of the time.
Yes.
And so that's a strong way of evoking like a very visceral emotion from a player.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Go
and
ahead.
also, I was going to say, on the way to the temple, you fly on the back of an eagle. And so that's
Yeah.
another cue that I sent you.
Yes.
And so that one is really interesting. Like you make a deal with one of the characters in the game, and everyone gets on the back of this eagle, and you end up fighting all these creatures, these small bird-like people that fly onto the eagle's back as you fight them off. And with that one, the instrumentation is a little different because I felt like I wanted to capture the feeling of flying through the air. And I felt like the woodwinds playing these flurries on top
Mm-hmm.
of the more action oriented music helped give a feeling of flying through the air, and this feeling of adventure and excitement as you're approaching the Temple of Majasa. Um, and so the woodwinds, I felt like, really captured that. And then halfway through your flight, the there's a ballista on the ground that fires a giant arrow that skewers the eagle that you're flying on the
No,
back of, unfortunately.
it's a federal
And
crime.
as if it should be, yes. And so as the eagle plummets to the earth, there's more woodwind flurries and excitement that happens there, and that happens about halfway through the cue. So you're fighting, and then the music switches when after you beat all the enemies, and then the
Mm-hmm.
eagle gets skewered. I feel like that's one of the highlights of that whole chapter is this flight on the back of the eagle on the way to the temple. It's always very exciting for me every time I play it. I look forward to that scene.
Nice. Yeah, it's really, really nice stuff. I love the temple track. I also love Crystal Mines. Can you talk to me about Crystal Mines?
Sure. So there's a cave area on one of the levels where you explore through there, and as you're exploring, you fight a lot of fungus creatures that are um, they come to life and they attack you. And but at first, the beginning of the track has you in a more explorative manner, and you're exploring through all these caves. There's stalactites and there's glowing crystals, and for that one, I used a lot of sounds that I played on a instrument, which
Mm-hmm.
is a crazy MIDI instrument. I guess for someone that's watching this, I can lift it up
Yeah, yeah.
here. It looks like this. It's got all sorts of crazy lights and these pads that you play on. Oh, hold on. These pads that you play on
Yeah.
are sort of you can have them arrayed however you want, but this is sort of arrayed like a guitar fingerboard.
Oh,
So,
cool.
but as you play the pads, like you can get these different sounds and different textures from them, and that's sort of what I use as the background of the track.
Mhm.
And they sound very percussive. They still fit with the whole feeling of the game and of that era. But there's something about playing on a different instrument that you're not that familiar with that has like a level of mystery to it
Mhm.
itself. Like if I
Mhm.
play piano, like I know where all the notes are, I know what's going on. But with this, it sort of puts you in a different frame of mind,
Mhm.
and it makes you sort of go down different paths as you're writing music, right? And then
Mhm.
just the tactile nature of hitting these pads in a certain way, I feel like makes you write a different way also than if you're playing a stringed instrument or if you're playing a piano. So a lot of times, in order to get out of my head and to try to explore new territory, I'll try to pick up a new instrument or a new way of recording, and then that leads me down different paths, and I explore things that I wouldn't have explored ordinarily. So
Sure.
yeah, the beginning of that is the instrument, and then also in there is the fretless bass, which is my one of my favorite instruments.
Yeah.
And it has like such an evocative sound.
Yeah.
And so the electric bass was invented, I think in the 50s. And then along the lines, people started pulling out the frets.
Such a
You
weird
know,
choice, and I'm so glad they did it.
I'm so glad they did it.
Yeah.
And you would think it would still just sound like a bass, but it doesn't. It sounds like a new instrument almost.
Yeah.
And it has this really warm, woody, interesting feeling to it,
Yeah.
where because the strings are directly touching the wood of the fingerboard instead of a fret where the fret has a different sound.
Mhm.
And like Jaco Pastorius is a famous fretless electric bass player, and he's a jazz guy. There's a lot of jazz guys used it, but it sounds great on like interesting ethereal soundtracks where you don't want people to necessarily know where the instrument is from. Like, what is that? Like, it has
That's
this kind of
great.
otherworldly sound to it. You put enough reverb on it and everything, it makes it sound really cool.
Nice. Well, I never would have picked out that that was fretless bass. So, what are some of the other instruments that you snuck in there in that way? Because I'm sure there are a lot of, instruments that you played yourself to make all these sounds. So, what else did you do?
So besides the Lindstrument and the fretless bass, I have some charango on that, and the
Oh,
charango
cool.
is
Yeah.
it's an instrument from the Andes, and it has 10 strings, and I have to like it's another one of these instruments that you kind of have to tune it up between takes because it's just the way it is. It goes out of
Mhm.
tune. And it's like a small guitar. It's about the size of a shoebox and a little bigger than a shoebox. And the strings are all doubled. So that means that like when you play one note, you're actually playing the same note twice because you're playing two strings at the same time each time you play a note. And that's just kind of how the instrument is laid out, and so it gives it this kind of weird chimey folksy sound to it that these doubled strings give you that you just don't have on other instruments. It makes it a little more difficult to play because you're really playing two notes at the same time,
Yeah.
but the way the spacing is it's not quite that difficult, but it gives it this interesting sound that sounds exotic but also very difficult to place. And with the trongo, it's like you play chords mostly with it, or you can play single notes with it too, and
Mhm.
there's a bit of both in there in that track.
Cool. Cool. How about the rest of the soundtrack in general? Like, what are some of the other acoustic instruments that you used?
So there's a bit of 12-string acoustic guitar, which is similar to the Trongo in that it has these doubled strings,
Mhm.
and that I played for a couple of the tracks, and that also a lot of times I would put the reverb on that and the delay in order to give it that fuller sound that keeps repeating. And there's some oud for the Majasa
Neat.
tracks, which is great. It's a Middle Eastern instrument, so it evokes a little bit
So
of the
great.
Middle Eastern sound. And we're talking about sandy areas. It's not
Mm.
too far of a stretch to have some like Middle Eastern instruments in there. And I feel like they often evoke a desert kind of feeling anyway, just because we
Mhm.
have that association in our mind with those
Yeah,
instruments.
for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you sent me one other track. You're like, you had sent me a bunch, and then you're like, I forgot to send you my favorite track. So
Yeah.
we gotta give some time to that particular track because I don't even know the name of that one. It just says full final mastered.
Oh, okay. So that one is the Majelka Way Station.
Oh, cool.
And so you travel to all these different areas, and then they have these way stations, which are different sort of hubs that can take you to different areas. And with the Majelka Way Station, it will take you to Majelka, and that one has a more just a orchestral sound to it. But this is one of the earliest tracks I wrote for the game, and
Mm.
it's a very mellow area. Like there's no battles. It's more of like the plot of the game is unfolding, and somehow when I was writing it, you have these moments where like, oh, I don't remember how that came about, and like what your brain was thinking at the time when you wrote it, but then you're really happy about it like afterwards, and you're like, wow, where did that come from? So that I think that track for me. Maybe other people might not like it as much because it's not as action oriented, and it's
Mm.
more like thoughtful and moody track. But for me, I feel like it really transports me to another place, and just how the track came about is kind of mysterious because like I mean I kind of remember writing it, but it it's in this part of my brain that somehow was accessed when I was into it, and I hope I get back to that part of my brain again because I liked it.
So, the game itself has such a grand scope, right? Talk about how much music you've written, how much more you think. I mean, that might be a hard question to answer, but you can at least address how much you've written so far.
Sure. Yeah, I've written about an hour of music so far since February,
Mm.
and the game is going to have probably about 4 hours of music when all is said and done.
Wow. And early access now. It's been in early access for quite some time, right? Or
It
several months
has.
at least. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think of like a year and a half. And so all of the different areas that are going to be in launch are already there. But right
Yeah.
now, we're just in the process of making everything better.
Yeah.
So
That's cool.
the plot of it is might change a bit, but like the different locations and the overall feeling of the game is going to be there. So people
Yeah.
are playing it, right? And then they get an update, and then hey, these graphics look different. Oh, these creatures are here that weren't here before. They keep getting things are just constantly being like reworked and
Yeah.
changed around until the final launch when we're pretty much locking it in place. And so it's been this interesting process of seeing the game evolve. It's very different from just buying a game and playing it when it's all finished. It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
hey, this is what we see is what we get. This is it. This is
Yeah.
sort of like you play it one time, then you might play it a month later, and things are different and things are not
Sure.
where they were before.
Yeah.
So as developers, it's great. So we get to keep working on it, and we get feedback from the players and from the fan base, and they help guide what things are happening in the game. If people really like a certain thing, then that influences the way we design it. And
That's
so
very cool.
it's been a really interesting process. It's very different from just making a game and putting it out there.
Yeah. So I imagine you're kind of working through, you personally, Erik, are working through with new music based off of each era. You're not doing all of them at once, right? You're kind of like, I'll do this section and then we'll do this section. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
And we're trying to, so that's a big part of it, is trying to figure out what makes the Divine Era sound like the Divine Era. What instruments are being used in the Divine Era? Like what can we use to help capture the visuals with the music, and what has the best symbiosis between the visuals and the music, and the best complementary sounds for this area in this era.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned you played it. I mean, tell me a little bit about your experience playing it and how that has guided you musically.
So it's been so much fun playing the game because I'm a huge fan of the genre, right? And like when I applied for the position and like was contacting them about it, a big part of it was like, what other ARPG games have you played? I'm like, which ARPG games have I not played? Yeah. So it's basically my favorite genre, that or just an action like Zelda type game, which of course Zelda is very near and dear to my heart. And but Diablo games, Diablo the series, as well as The Witcher. I'm a huge fan of The Witcher, and that's a fantastic ARPG game. And Skyrim, I don't know how many millions of hours I've logged on Skyrim. And so it was like a really natural fit for me, and for me to play it and be like, this is the game I'm working on. I'm working on this game, which is basically a lot like the games that I love, but it's new and it's different. It's got time travel. It's got all these different characters, and it's definitely got its own world. And I'm helping to create this world. And like, what can I do to make this world sound more unique? And I feel like with the theme, like that was the first time where it was like, this is the vision of the game. Like, this is what we're putting forth to the fans, and we're putting it out there. Whereas before, like we had visions and stuff, but it's all been kind of like the Wild West, basically, in terms of the different pieces of music that are being used in the game right now. And like the continuity of the tracks needs to be improved. But the theme was like, boom, this is what we're going for, this is what we're doing. And then the fan reaction has been really positive with it, and there's people on Reddit that are like explaining how much they like the new theme and talking about it. Hey, props to the composer, we love this new theme. And the theme plays right when you log into the game, so it's the very first piece of music you hear as you go on the login screen. Then you create your character, you're hearing the theme, and that theme is going to have a ripple effect throughout the game, and we're going to use parts of that theme in all these different locations, but of course tweak them and make them sound more consistent with each area and with each era of the game.
Cool. That's awesome. So I mean, yeah. So what are you working on the Divine Era right now? Is that what you're kind of parsing through?
So we're actually really doing more of an overview right now, and we're figuring out like what each era is going to sound like, and figure out the just the overall vibes of the different eras and areas. And then we're going to go through and refine, like throw out cues that don't work, or enhance cues that do work, and write music where it's needed. Like, since the game is evolving, there's a lot of like little side things that are being added, and different characters are starting to have different themes. So you meet a character and then their theme plays, that kind of thing. And then that theme plays later on when there's a boss battle with that character, right? How do I make a melody that sounds good and is not going to get in the way when you meet them at first, and it fills you with a feeling, and then later on it's played in a very intense way as a boss battle cue, right? With big percussion, or however we decide to approach it. But the melody is going to has to have this duality to it, where it can work well as an underscore element and just a subtle like theme that plays while you're talking to a character, and then hey, boom, here it is, like fully realized as he's kicking your butt and your character's dying, and he's destroying you with tentacles or whatever that creature is using to destroy you with.
Oh, great. Well, I can't wait to hear as it gets released. That'll be really fun to hear. And it's been a pleasure. So if there's anything else you want to add about the music before we say goodbye.
Sure. I'd love to talk a little bit about the vocalists that I hired.
Yes. I wanted to ask you about that because there are vocals in that main theme, but then I think there's one other track that you sent me that has some vocals too. So talk about them.
So we had decided on the actual main theme, like the melody and everything. We had sort of a process where I wrote different themes and stuff, and then we coalesced on this one that we all really liked. And then I was trying to figure out how to make it sound different, how to make it sound like last Epoch, and how to have it for this this character select screen where you're creating your character. So I was like, well, a lot of it takes place in the ancient era, so maybe we can have the singers singing in Old Norse. And I feel like Old Norse has like an ancient sound to it. A lot of the pronunciations are not being used anymore, so they're used, you hear them a little bit in everyday speech, like where it's just like this sound is actually used in Old Norse. It's an interesting language where when you speak it, the syllable is always on the first, the accent is always on the first syllable, right? So it gives it like this sort of aggressive feeling almost, because it's always like, how are you doing? Ha, da, da, da. Everything is every word is always the first syllable is accented. So it has like a strength to it, I feel like. And then, so I had to find vocalists to sing on it. And someone was recommended to me. His name is Mcginnis. And he is the main part of the male vocals that you hear when the male vocals first come in. And he overdubbed himself many times, and so he has almost sounds like a choir in himself, right? Because of all of the different variations of him singing it and doubling it on top, gives it this fullness. And then there's Matt Lambert and Mason Lieberman are also singing on top of it as the male vocals. And I've worked with both of them before. They're fantastic. And so they're also part of the choir, or when there's shouts, you can hear them individually. Matt Lambert has a more of a higher voice, so when people are yelling Fjord Uld, he's like Fjord Uld. He always sounds like this angry Viking that's yelling.
Yeah.
That's like a smaller angry Viking. And Mason has a very deep, rich, full voice, and he's singing in there too as well. You can hear them all throughout the main theme. And the female vocalist her name is Fionn Elisa, and she's lives in northern Wales. And she had sung a bunch of Viking stuff for another project. I think it was a production music album, and it just sounded perfect for this setting, right? And she has like a kind of like this raw quality to her voice. It doesn't sound overly trained. It's perfectly in tune. Very, very like emotional sounding voice. And so she sings the introduction to the theme, and of course here and there throughout the theme at the main parts. And then the process of getting them to sing in Old Norse is also very interesting. So, how do I write lyrics in Old Norse? Like, what do I do? So one thing I did is I looked at these old poems that were written in Old Norse, and of course they're written out in Old Norse. So how do I pronounce that? Well, lucky for me, there's a YouTube channel by Dr. Jackson Crawford, who is a PhD in ancient languages. Nice. And he makes all these videos where he's wearing a cowboy hat and he's in Colorado, and he's talking about how to pronounce these different words in Old Norse. And one of the sounds, it looks like an O with a slash through it, and that sounds like the word bird, but the word bird as pronounced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So like bird, like how does Schwarzenegger pronounce it? Bird. And then there's another sound, which is like I forget what it looked like. Maybe it had some dots on it or something. But this one was how a northern New Jersey person would pronounce the word coffee. So it's a wah, quah, wah sound. It's like, okay, and then this other one is the way a surfer dude would say the word gluey, dude, gluey. So I'm trying to like pull these different ways of pronouncing words together, and have it make sense and have it relate to Last Epoch, right? So that in Last Epoch, there's the void that starts taking over, and these creatures come out of the void. But of course, there's no ancient Norse poems about creatures coming out of the void. So what do? Look up void, creature, and try to figure out how the words would be conjugated so that it would make sense. And luckily, one of the guys on the team, like I was mentioning earlier, team is all over the world. So one of the guys is from Denmark, and he's lived in Denmark his whole life. And so whenever I had any kind of question about how to pronounce a certain like word or some weird symbol that I've never seen, he was like, oh no, that's pronounced like this, blah blah blah. It's like very similar to this word. And he actually helped come up with some of the lyrics too, because he's so deeply involved in the game and in the plot part of it. So he was like, oh, you should use this as the characters and this word. And then one of the phrases he suggested that would be chanted was ek Erik, ek Erik, which, hey, that sounds kind of like Eric, right? Ek Erik, it means I am mighty, but it also sounds kind of like I'm saying Eric, So that was really fun to sort of to put that in the background as one of these chants. And then I had to have the singers sing it, and they're not experts in Old Norse, so I had to go through and actually sing it myself as a guide track, right?
Sure.
I'm not a vocalist, right? And when I sing, unfortunately my voice sounds a lot like Kermit the Frog from the Muppets. And so there's a version of it where it sounds like the Muppets are singing this theme before it's replaced by a guy from Northern Ireland and a woman from Northern Wales, and like these people that are giving it a whole lot of weight and depth and anger. And it's like you have Kermit singing in Old Norse. And then I send that version to Reimer, and he was like, oh, well, you're not, this word should be pronounced a little differently. This should do this and that. So then I did another version of this guide track and then sent it to them. And they're not all in the room together, right? Because they're all recording remotely. So like that was actually very important to be able to like have everyone agree on a sound. And then luckily Calm ended up recording first. And so then he would listen to the guide track, and then I could send his version to other people, and then they all kind of matched his. And I mean, when I was first investigating using Calm, he had recorded a song in Old Norse. So I was like, oh, this guy already kind of knows basically how to do an Old Norse, and it's obviously going to be different words, but he kind of already gets it. And and so his version after the Kermit version became like the definitive version of how to sing this music in Old Norse and the pronunciation. And then it was easy for everyone else to sort of like jump on top of that, and like if there was any kind of question in how a word would be pronounced, they could look at that. They also wrote it out phonetically in sheet music, so they could look at the words, even so I'm not using the weird A and the E combined or the O with the slash through it. It just looks like English, and how you pronounce it in English. But then again, there was also a funny instance where Fionn was pronouncing it a different way, because that's how a person from Wales would pronounce those words that were written in English. Because for the opening, I didn't send her a guide track at first, and she did a fantastic job, but the words were pronounced as a person from Wales would pronounce the words written out. And so I was like, okay, but I actually meant this, but I can understand that, your Welsh accent would make it sound like this. So I had to go back and record a guide track and then send it to her, and then everything worked out perfectly. Sure. She is amazing. I can't recommend her highly enough in terms of professionalism and just artistry. She just sounds amazing. So I'm very happy with her.
The track's amazing. And they're turning that into a music video, right?
Yeah. So I also had all of the vocalists record themselves, like video record themselves as well. And it's going to be really fun, because a lot of the vocalists are very emotional when they sing. And cool. They raise their hands up and they put their hands down and with their head down, and they really it really enhances the music. And so there's going to be a lot of split screen production of the music, where you see like the vocalists singing together and stuff. And it's interesting, it's a whole, this project came together from people all over the world, and same with the theme, people in Ireland and Wales and LA and all over the place are all coming together to make it sound great. And it's the best of all worlds, I feel like.
I love that. Yeah, it's so cool. I can't wait to see the video. So that'll be good. Yeah.
And Kermit the Frog is not going to make an appearance in the video.
I would almost pay you cash just to get to hear that.
I should get a little puppet of it and just film him doing it. And
you should. You really should.
Into the video and have a little Kermit-y version.
Amazing. I love that. I did it when I was in college, and many years ago, a friend of mine told me that when I run, I look like Kermit.
Yeah.
Which I thought was pretty funny, because I just have really long limbs, and so I think so that's funny that you say you sing like Kermit. I sing
like Kermit. We've got the body of Kermit.
Exactly.
I've got the voice of Kermit. We've got it all together.
We've got it.
Now we need someone who's green, and then
exactly. Well, what else, Erik? Anything else that I forgot to ask you about? I'm so glad you reminded me about the vocalists.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I made a little list about stuff I wanted to cover, and vocals were on there. And
I love that.
We hit that. So
that's good. Cool.
Well prepared.
Great. Well, thanks again. Always a pleasure to hear new music from you. And that's the other thing, since the game's not out and obviously the soundtrack isn't out yet. So how can people hear the music right now?
So right now there's a YouTube playlist, and it's just you just Google it and it'll come up on YouTube, and it has them all in a pretty good order. We are also posting the tracks on lastepoch.com. So there's all these there's a bunch of social media posts, and then people comment on the tracks and stuff. Hopefully they like it. You never know.
Yeah.
And so that's where when the video is going to be released, it's going to be on lastepoch.com and also on YouTube. And I think it'll end up being part of the playlist as well.
Cool.
And so, yeah, people can subscribe to the playlist and they'll get notifications when they pop up. They've been doing a nice thing with a lot of the music that you're going to feature on the podcast. Is they make these visualizers where it has colors and themes from the Last Epoch game, and you see it sort of, it's like a graphic representation of the music, which looks really cool. I feel like it has like a nice moody tone to it, and it's fun to look at something when you listen to music and see like there's little peaks pop up when there's big hits or something. It's just fun.
Yeah.
And so that's also on the YouTube playlist. Then eventually we'll have a Spotify one when the game is released and stuff. And
cool. All right. Well, Erik, thanks again. Such a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. It's always so much fun to talk to you about games and music for games.